Dr. Harlan Hoy is a professor of English here at UMaine, and she holds a PhD and master's in medieval studies from Cornell University and a BA in English literature and Spanish literature from the University of Montana. Her main research and teaching interests are medieval literature, literature in the environment, and folklore and oral traditional studies. And she's published on medieval outlaw narratives, as well as Old Norse, Old English, and Middle English literature and culture, as well as several pedagogical studies. So if anyone has an interest in medieval or a Renaissance minor, Dr. Harlan Hoy would be the person to talk to. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Snell. Let me just, can you hear me? Everyone in the back, can you hear me? Okay. Well, thanks for being here. Usually when I give this lecture, it's like really, really nice outside and nobody shows up because they're all enjoying the first sunny day. But today, that's not the issue. So we'll try to make it not too depressing and a little interesting, hopefully. I like to have lectures be, participatory. So if you have any questions at any point, please do not hesitate to raise your hand, say something, ask a question, tell me to shut up, slow down, whatever. Also, my class is here. I have a 300 level medieval lit class here. Our class is at the same time as this. So we just happen to be discussing Canterbury Tales this week, and it occurred to me that we could just combine the classes. So that's why we have some extra people in this lecture hall today. We're going to just do a few things today. Our plan is to, one, discuss medieval culture in the 14th century, in the era that Chaucer was writing, just briefly go over some of the historical contexts of that period. We're going to talk a little bit about Chaucer's biography, the man who is responsible for writing the Canterbury Tales and a bunch of other texts. And we're going to talk about certain aspects of the Canterbury Tales. I know you're reading, let me just make sure, the prologue, Wife of Bath's tale, the Franklin's tale, and the Pardoner's tale. Is that correct? Okay, sweet. And so we'll talk a little bit about sort of some of the questions that are raised by the Canterbury Tales, and then we'll take a break, and I want you to think ahead of time, so here's your assignment. I know that in honors, you read a lot of texts, and you read a lot of texts that are written in other languages, in particular in the 100 level. So this is the first time you guys can engage with a text in its original language, which is Middle English, okay? It looks different from modern English, but it is understandable. So this is the first time I'm going to allow, I think this is the first time where you're going to be reading a text in its original. So we're going to do a little bit of that today. So what I want you to think about as your assignment for the second part of this class is there a passage in any of the texts that you read for today that you want to look at in Middle English and see what's going on with the language, okay? Because you're reading in translation for your preceptorials, but I have with me here the great tome of Chaucer's poetry in Middle English, okay? And I can open it to whatever page and we can find out exactly what the poet said, okay? So I'm not gonna let you off the hook. If you don't have anything to talk about, I'll just open a page at random and do bibliomancy, right? Just find something to talk about. So it's probably better if you just, say I'm really curious about what's going on with, I don't know, the squire and the general prologue, okay? So that'll be the second part of the class. It'll be much less structured, and it will rely on your participation and suggestion of passages that we can look over. Does that make sense? Does that seem like a doable agreement? I'm waiting for some nods. Yeah? Okay, sweet, thank you. Okay, so this is from the Wife of Bath's prologue. She says, "For trusteth well, it is an impossible that any clerk will speak good of weavers. But if it be of holy saints leavers, ne of none other woman, never the more. Who painted the leon? Tell me who. Begod, if woman had written stories, as clerks han within her oratories, they would han written of men more wickedness than all the mark of Adam, my redresser." Okay, that's Middle English, that's what it sounds like. I know you might not be able to read this word for word, but what's Wife of Bath saying here? Can I get a hint? Yes?
She's basically women were the ones writing the stories. They make men into the jealous, horrible, evil sort of caricatures that frequently women do.
Yeah. Okay, so who are writing things down? People with educations. Who get educations? Most often, men, right? So who's writing stories? Mostly men. And so who's producing stories? Men, right? So the Wife of Bath's point is, of course, if women could write the stories, they might tell a lot of stories about wicked men, like the ones that her husband Jenkin reads to her in his book of Wicked Wives, right? And so this is a interesting intertextual conversation she's having with one of Aesop's fables, okay? So we're starting to get really intertextual. Lots of texts are talking to each other, right? Once we get to the late medieval period. We've got this sort of buildup of the Western literary canon, and all these people are sort of recombining texts in interesting new ways. So the Wife of Bath is responding to this Aesop's fable, and I'll just read it to you. A man and a lion were arguing about who was best, with each one seeking evidence in support of his claim. They came to a tombstone on which a man was shown in the act of strangling a lion, and the man offered this picture as evidence. The lion then replied, "It was a man who painted this. If a lion had painted it, you would instead see a lion strangling a man. But let's look at some real evidence instead." The lion then brought the man to the amphitheater and showed him, so he could see with his own eyes, just how a lion strangles a man. The lion then concluded, "A pretty picture is not proof. Facts are the only real evidence. When the evidence is fairly weighed, a colorfully painted lie is quickly refuted by the facts." Okay, grim story, right? We can presume that the lion has strangled a man in the amphitheater, right? Any other things that are interesting about this passage from Aesop's Fables? It's interestingly not speciesist, right? If we want to use those terms, right? Like we're seeing this sort of empathetic understanding that, animals also have been subject to representation or misrepresentation by human beings, right? So the lion is pointing that out for us, okay? So the Wife of Bath is co-opting that narrative and attaching it to her, what we might call a sort of, proto-feminist narrative, right? Okay, who painted the lion? Whoever paints the lion gets to dictate how we read him. So, how would a lion paint himself, right? Probably in the act of killing a man, right? Or something else. Probably not even having anything to do with men, right? A lion, if he could paint himself, probably wouldn't care at all about the human world, is what I would imagine. So, I'm going to expand this question now. How would you paint the Middle Ages, okay? We all have grown up with notions about what the medieval looks like. A lot of it's colored probably by pop culture, which is totally fine, right? Things like Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, right? And also popular conceptions about, things like the plague and, the Dark Ages, scare quotes, right? So would you paint it like this, right? Here's a classic image from the Duc de Berry's Très Riche, right? A very famous book of Psalms and other things, a calendar of the year. Here we have very nicely dressed noble people out in the month of May. They're a-Maying, right, which is an important thing. One does, and one's part of the sort of noble class, and enjoying the nice weather like we all wish we were, right? So that's one image we may be familiar with, like lords and ladies, love, courtly love, all that stuff. Another one might be something like this, right? A hellscape, lots of suffering, torture, and ignorance, right? Of course, Dante's Inferno in some ways explores this kind of hellish notion of the Middle Ages, but of course complicates it in a lot of different ways. And I know you just got done with your Dante unit. So, I don't know, anyone else have anything that they would bring up if they think about the medieval that isn't sort of encapsulated by those two images? Yeah. Yeah, a disease, right? Yeah, I mean, you can kind of imagine, these are not easy enough to see, but there are some poxed people in that. Yeah, but yeah, the sort of notion of people being sick all the time, short lifespans, etc. Plague, definitely, yeah. Anything else? The Middle Ages are interesting specifically because they're one of those time periods when people feel comfortable just kind of projecting whatever image or imaginary space onto them that they want. It's kind of like Orientalism or something, right? The Middle Ages are in between the classical period and the modern period. They don't seem to have their own identity. They're sort of like in between. They're a time that we seem to not know as much about, right? So they become this sort of empty space onto which we can sort of I guess I could use this word again, project our notions of some otherness that's different from our time. Does that make sense? Okay, so just worth thinking about, not for today, but in the future, when you encounter medieval texts, what are the assumptions you're making about them? Okay, so Chaucer's writing in the 14th century in England, right? And this is a famously nasty century, okay? A famous writer, Barbara Tuchman, in the 70s called it the calamitous 14th century. Other people describe this time as the crisis of the 14th century. But what's definitely true is in the 14th century, in England and all over Europe, there were a series of convulsions, right? And you might have actually talked about this before, that really changed the face of society, probably forever, okay? So it was a tough time to be living in some ways. But I mean, I guess I'd ask you again to sort of put that in perspective. We're living in a tough time right now, right? There have been series of tough times throughout the history of the world. So what makes the Middle Ages different, okay? So that's another sort of rhetorical question for you. So I'm going to go through the major crises of the 14th century. They're going to show up on the left side of the page. And then I'm going to talk about some of the effects of those crises, which are it's not like pros and cons, but you'll see that some of the effects of some of the negative events actually ended up, having side effects that were not necessarily bad, okay? So first, we have the notion of plague and famine, okay? In the 14th century, we entered the Little Ice Age, which changed the way crops are grown and changed the output, the amount of yield one would get from agriculture. And this led to widespread famine, especially in the British Isles. So a lot of people were going hungry, especially in the first few decades of the 14th century. To compound this misery, the two big waves of Black Plague, bubonic plague, hit Western Europe, okay? And decimated, probably, we think, at least in Britain, 60% of the population, okay? So we're talking about massive death. And the plague really struck in two very short time spans. It wasn't like it was ongoing throughout the 14th century. There were two sort of crisis points where most of the people died. So really, really nasty years, plague years, okay? What was the result of this? Okay, well, a lot of demographic scholars believe now that Europe was overpopulated in the early part of the 14th century. So a bunch of people die off, you get a lot more resources to go around for the people who survive. It's kind of it's not the best consolation in the world when you've lost at least half your family, right, on average, but that leads to a lot of social mobility, okay? So people who used to be serfs or work the land and not have very much ability to, like, say, become members of the middle class or the bourgeoisie or move from the rural to the urban centers, right? These people found themselves all of a sudden with a lot of buying power and the ability to move into professions and things that they might not have otherwise been able to access, okay? So we see a lot of sort of social fermentation here, okay, as a result. Questions about this? Does it make sense? Okay. Number two, constant warfare. Okay, yeah. England was at war almost all the time during Chaucer's age. It's called the 100 Years' War. It was one of the major ongoing battles, which is sort of in between England and France over various issues, mostly having to do with who owned what land. And so that meant that a lot of people were pressed into service in the army. A lot of people would go serve in a war and then find themselves in the classic position of veterans, right, coming back with injuries and potentially not finding any employment, right, and then ending up basically homeless, joining bands of, bandits or outlaws or, roving like homeless groups right in the woods, which might lead to the rise of the literature that I study more specifically, outlaw narratives, right? So you see this on the one hand, like a lot of war, but the war is kind of like our wars, right? It's not really on the soil of Great Britain. It's elsewhere, right? So all these taxes are being raised, people are being sent elsewhere, but you're not seeing, the war on your own property in your own country, okay? So this leads to like a new age of social critique. A lot of people are saying, why are we fighting all the time? Who's benefiting from this? What complex of military industrial power is making this continue? Why do we keep paying the king to go to war? Is this actually necessary and is a just, right? So again, we see the rise of sort of what we would call sort of anti-war social critique in this period. As a result of the high taxes for this and other reasons, you see also a really amazing level of organization and populist uprisings. The most famous example is the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. This is an amazing thing that happened. It seems that people who would be classed in the peasant category, and this is a category that's becoming more and more wavy in the late 14th century, somehow created pre-social media an incredible network of communication with one another. And ultimately, this resulted in a massive moving protest that moved upon London and demanded, for one, a raised minimum wage, right? So a standard minimum wage under which nobody could go, right? So they're demanding a baseline minimum wage. They're demanding fewer taxes. They're demanding social equality. A lot of the things that we're still talking about today, it felt like it just appeared out of nowhere, but actually there was this incredible sort of like network of people working to make this revolt happen. It scared the crap out of the people in power. So, what else? What else do we have on this list? My little thingy's not working. It's like it goes to sleep. Okay. You saw from Dante probably. In this period, the Catholic Church is also in crisis. Okay, the Catholic Church is the monolithic, religious power in the Western world until you get to Byzantium, Eastern Orthodox area, or the Middle East. And so, as you'll see from Dante and from Chaucer, right, there's a definite concern about misuse of religious power by people who are supposed to represent God and the church institution, but instead abuse their power. And we're going to talk about that probably more when we get to the second part of this class and discuss specific moments in Chaucer's text, right? Also, you probably might have noticed from Dante, right, the church is in its schism at early part of this period. And there are actually two popes at one point. So the church itself is sort of going through convulsions. So what's the result of this? Well, a lot of critique again, right? People are starting to become aware of the fact that, maybe the Catholic Church doesn't have all the answers, right? Maybe it's become such a giant bureaucracy that it's impossible to fix. Maybe we need to think about other options. Maybe we need to go back to basics. Maybe we need to reconsider what it means to be Christian, right? I'm using a term that most scholars would tell me not to use, sort of notion of proto-Reformation. But you can certainly see, inklings of that kind of sentiment, say in Chaucer, right, when he shows us corrupt church represented after corrupt church representative, right? Even Dante, who was a devout and dedicated Catholic, certainly makes a lot of really cogent critiques of the Catholic Church, right? Okay. Questions? Comments? Okay. So as early nation states start to realize that they can exert more control over everybody's basic biological life by having somebody representing the crown, moving into each part of the country. You get more clerks, you get more justices of the peace, you get more sheriffs, right? You get this increased bureaucracy that helps oil the wheels of society, right? So you start to see a lot of people with sort of civil servant jobs. And that's not a bad thing, right? It's just a new kind of wave in Western culture. And the result of this, sort of the byproduct of all these people being educated, writing people, like clerks, or people who work for the local courts, or people who work for the church but aren't, ordained or made to take orders of chastity, is that you get a whole new population of people who write, right? People who think about things, who read a lot, and who write. So you get an increased vernacular production, not just literature, this sort of boom in poetry and, fiction, but also a boom in, philosophy, science, all those things. You get more people wanting to go to universities, right, and be educated. Universities themselves become incredible centers of learning. Oxford and Cambridge in this period, for example, to use examples from the British Isles, are just expanding like crazy. This is the great first golden age of the universities. Of course, I'm trying to think of a bad thing about this because I teach in universities. I'm like, universities are great. I mean, universities always have weird politics. People are always at each other's throats. I mean, there are lots of really dramatic stories from this period of, professors having fights with each other and, causing each other pain. But on the other hand, you see this sort of great rise of science and humanism. Some great thinkers appear in this period. So that's a very fast overview of the 14th century, and I definitely do agree with the common consensus. This is a tough time to be living, especially because of the plague, just in terms of trauma, seeing that many people that you love die really would do a number on you. And interestingly, a lot of the British poets that write in this period don't mention the plague at all, even though all of them lived through it. So the question is, why not, right? Is that one of those sort of traumatic silences, right? Where, Chaucer, I think, mentions the plague once, and it's obliquely in this gigantic body of work that he did. So that's kind of a big question, like, why is there such a silence about those plague years? Nobody's really answered that question satisfactorily. So if you want to discuss it or think about it, you're welcome to. So I'm going to just take a minute to make sure everyone's clear on this, or if anyone has any challenges or questions for me. Okay. So who's Chaucer? Who is Chaucer? Good question. I don't know. Okay, so this guy is amazing, first of all. We know more about Chaucer, for example, than we do about Shakespeare because he was a civil servant. He was one of those people who took advantage of this new upward mobility. He was the son of a merchant. His name means, does anyone know what his name means? Everyone's last name actually means something. Does anyone speak French here? Okay. It means shoemaker, right? Chaussure, right? Shoes. So his family were like people who potentially at some point made shoes. That's probably where the name came from, right? So we're talking working class, middle class bourgeois merchants, right? But Chaucer found himself, because he was a bright young man, right? He entered into royal service very young. And he worked his way up the ranks, learned how to read and write, and became a civil servant par excellence. Okay, so that was his day job. Chaucer's day job was always serving the bureaucracy of the crown. Okay, so he did all sorts of things. He, he worked as a spy because he was great with languages. So he would go abroad and bring back important information to basically like a nascent secret service that we think he worked for. He was a diplomat. He went abroad and made connections with people in other countries, made alliances and marriage alliances and other treaties with people in other countries. He was a soldier for a while. When he got really sort of powerful, he had actually one of the most powerful positions that a bourgeois person could hold, which sounds funny now, but it was the controller of wool. That's what his job was. And so basically he controlled all of the exports of wool to other countries. And in this period, England was the greatest, that was England's greatest export, wool. You can kind of imagine why, all those sheep, right? This is Wallace and Gromit land. So did all this stuff. He was a forester for a while. So when did he find time to write this much stuff? This is a gigantic book. This is like one of the questions we have about Chaucer. Like, is he one of those people who has more time in the day than the rest of us? And the answer is probably yes. It seems like he stayed up late at night every night writing his poetry because he was passionate about it. He also had a good reason to write poetry because in this period, poetry was a prestige thing, right? You shared it in the court. It was a way of moving socially upwards and upwards, right? If you were a good poet, you would then be asked to perform for fancy people who would then respond to your poetry, recommend you to other people, and all of a sudden you've got the ear of the king, right? And that seems to have been what Chaucer had. Chaucer was probably one of the most famous poets in the period. He was famous during his lifetime. We're talking about the period before the printing press, right? Everything has to be written by hand on manuscript. But Chaucer, at the height of his fame, actually oversaw scriptoria, right? Places where people wrote manuscripts that would just keep copying out his work one after another, right? So he was a best-selling. He was the Stephen King of the late 14th century, okay? Questions here? All right. Chaucer also happened to be come of age in a period where vernacular poetry, meaning poetry written in the language of whatever country you're in, not Latin, okay, not Latin and not Greek unless you're in Greece, was on the rise, okay? And Chaucer was able to tap into this partly because it was what was happening in England. Chaucer's definitely not the father of English poetry, as my class can tell you, right? We've been reading English poetry from way before Chaucer in my medieval classes here. But, you know, on the continent, someone like Dante, for example, made a really strong case for, okay, we can have really important high literature, right, written in a language other than Latin, because up to this point, you know, the language of the court, of philosophy, of the big sort of disciplines that matter was all written in Latin. The stuff that mattered was written in Latin. Entertainment stuff might be written in French, Italian, English, but like serious high literature would be written in Latin. Dante's like, hell no, I'm going to write, you know, the Divine Comedy that he did. And, you know, somebody like John de Meun in France is writing the Romance of the Rose. So this is something that's happening in the 14th century anyway. But Chaucer had the amazing good fortune, again, of getting to travel all over Europe, and he probably met Boccaccio. He certainly knew of Dante and loved Dante. He also, you know, read all the major French poets. And so he was able to bring back all that stuff to the boonies, basically, England, right? Which is considered to be the end of the world, basically, by most people in this period. And so Chaucer has sort of been seen in posterity as the poet who brought, you know, who reawakened English, or you know, brought English to, I don't know, higher topics. And those are all very charged terms that I don't necessarily agree with, but I'm just kind of outlining that narrative. So what do I think is interesting about Chaucer? Well, I don't know. I mean, there's so many things interesting about Chaucer. I could study him my whole life, and I probably will, and never really know how I feel about some of the things he writes, because he's such a complicated poet. But what I'm going to share with you today is Chaucer's amazing ability to give us a slice of life, to allow his characters to speak through his poetry. So we almost feel like we're not listening to Chaucer, but we're listening to a living being who's saying the words. So I'm going to give you a classic example. This is right before The Miller's Tale, which I know you guys didn't read. But it's an interesting one, because when we hear the Miller get ready to tell his tale, I know you read about the Miller in the general prologue. He's a sort of, he's a tough customer, right? He likes brawling, he likes wrestling, and he likes getting drunk, okay? But when the Miller speaks, it's almost like we're hearing somebody actually speak to us from the 14th century, okay? So I put the facing page translation on the right, but I do encourage you to read along with me on the Middle English on the left. The miller that for drunken was all pala, so that unneth upon his horse he sat, he no devala neither hood nor hat, ne bided no man for his courtesy, but in Pilate's voice he gan to cry, and swore, be arms and be blood and bones, he can a noble tala for the nones, with which he will now quit the knecht's tala. Our host saw that he was drunk of Allah and said, Abide, Robin, me lave brother, some better a man shall tell us first another, abide and let us work and thriftily. Be God as Saul, quoth he, that will not he, for he will speak or else go me way. Our host answered, Tell on, a devil way. Thou art a fool, thee wit is overcome. No hearkeneth, quoth the miller, all in some, but first he make a protestation that he am drunk, he know it be me son, he know it be me son, and therefore if he misspake or say, we did the all of Southwark you pray. Then Chaucer as narrator says, what should he more say, but this miller, he knowed his words for no man forbear, but told his careless tall in his manner, methinketh that he shall rehearse it here. And therefore every gentle wheat he pray, for God is love, damneth not that he say of evil intent, but for he mote rehearse his tall as all, be they what better or worse, or else false in some of me matter. And therefore, whoso listed not a herre, turn over the left and chase another taller, for he shall find it no great and smaller. Okay, can I get some comments on this passage? Everyone can attest that's had a class with me. I'm really good at awkward pauses. So if I don't see a hand, we could wait for a while. Yes, pink shirt.
Interesting hearing it because there's so many letters that we have in English that are completely cut out. Like there's a lot of E's that are cut out, a lot of K's that are cut out.
Yeah, a lot of things we now pronounce silently are pronounced out loud in Middle English.
It seems like they were a lot more like phonetically accurate.
Yeah, exactly. Modern English is a historically spelled orthography. Historic orthography is what we call it. So older pronunciations are preserved in the way we spell. If you think about other languages that you might be familiar with, like Spanish, for example, Spanish does not have a historic orthography, right? When you read Spanish, you pronounce what you're seeing based on the Spanish pronunciation rules. But English, French, both of those, they have weird spellings that reflect some older iteration of the language. Yeah, but you have to learn when you're a kid not to say the K's out loud, right? And then when you learn Middle English, you have to unlearn that and say knichtis, right? Kanoa, yeah. Okay, yeah.
I noticed a couple of these, the use of like me, for instance, is similar to kind of the Scottish dialect.
Yeah.
A couple of connections there.
Totally, yeah. So you can see the roots of modern dialectical differences in Middle English, yeah. So you might hear some Scottish type English, even some things like, Southern American dialects, you hear some of the seeds in Middle English, yeah, for sure. Yes, yeah.
Isn't this also why some Shakespeare sonnets don't rhyme because it goes to
Yeah.
early modern English?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, we're before the great vowel shift, right? So we pronounce o, a, e, o, u instead of a, e, I, o, u, right? And by Shakespeare's time, this vowel shift was still taking place. So that's why sometimes, yeah, as you say, the N rhymes in Shakespeare don't seem to line up because some of the vowel sounds hadn't quite changed. Yeah, or there was a little bit of more leeway in the way you could pronounce something. Okay, what about content here? What's interesting about what the Miller says, or what Chaucer says about what the Miller's saying? Well, to get to my point, I'll just throw this in there and then I want to hear from you again. The Miller is saying, he's like, the way he's saying it, the way he's talking, it all rhymes, so it's clearly artificial, right? It's artificial text, it's poetic, it's been manipulated by the poet to rhyme and have meter, right? But the kind of way he's talking sounds like something you might hear on the street, right? I know a noble tale, I can tell you, by God's blood and bones, right? Lots of swearing, very like low language, if we want to use that kind of like terminology. Yeah. So Chaucer just sticks it out there, right? He's not trying to make it sound fancy. He just wants us to hear the Miller talk. Yeah. What do you make about this disingenuous claim by Chaucer? He was drunk. He's a churl. He's a fool. Sorry you have to read his tale, right? I'm sorry that I have to record his tale here, right? If it offends you, turn the page and look at another story. Now, was there a real Miller, or did he actually tell a tale? Like, probably not, right? So he's like pushing all the responsibility for what's going to be a really dirty story onto a fictional character, right? So there's a lot of sort of feinting and distancing going on here. It's very hard to tell if Chaucer's being tongue-in-cheek here, or if he's afraid of us, right? That we might get angry at him for his what he's about to write, right? Why all this deflection? Anything else of interest to you guys? Yes?
Also been doing it to get people's attention so that they're like, ooh, there's something really good coming.
Yeah.
Like when the graphic comes up and says, may not be suitable for children.
Yeah, totally, right. I know this may offend some of you because it's full of sex and violence. So if you don't want to like read about sex and violence, find something else. Well, most people are probably going to read on, right? Because we're attracted to risque narrative, I would argue, right? Yeah, so it could serve as a sort of, backhanded advertisement or something. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Okay. So that's, I think, Chaucer's achievement is sort of ventriloquizing that he does. And so I like to make the analogy between Chaucer and Proteus, right? Proteus is the god of, what is he the god of, all you classics people? I know you're reading a lot of classics. Is he a river god or is he an ocean god? It's a water god of some kind. I can't remember exactly. Anyone remember? Well, anyway, here's from the Odyssey. Odysseus is going to catch Proteus, who's going to come out of the ocean. There we waited patiently all morning, and herds of seals came up from the sea. They lay down in rows along the beach, and at noon the old man, Proteus, emerged, and it found the sleek ranks of seals. He looked them over and tallied them, and not expecting our deceit, counted us among the first. Then he lay down to sleep. With a shout, we rushed at him and grappled him, but he forgot none of his crafty tricks. First he turned into a bearded lion, then a snake, then a leopard, then a giant boar, then he became rushing water, then a vast leafy tree, but we held tight with unyielding courage. So this Protean water god, right, can't be grasped. The minute you try to grab him, he changes form, he turns into something else. And that's how I feel like my relationship with Chaucer is, right? Whenever I try to get a sense of what Chaucer actually wants me to believe, or whatever Chaucer actually believed himself, he changes shape, right? And that's what I think is one of the most amazing things about this poet. Okay, and there he is again. Actually, you know, the depiction of Chaucer is often pretty consistent. He tends to look like this. Again, probably a reflection of the fact that we actually do know a lot about him. We have something like 300 records of his life in text from this period, besides what he wrote himself. Okay, to kind of push on this question of ventriloquism a little further, when I say that Chaucer sort of is able to speak with the voices of a lot of different people, I like also to make this analogy with music. So I'm going to play this music excerpt. Just listen. Okay, that's probably enough. This is an early example of medieval polyphony. Okay, can I get a description of what you're hearing here? We have a drone, right, and then we have a bunch of voices going in opposite directions from one another, right? Which results in what? Tension. Do I have any musicians here? Can anyone say anything else? Yeah. Oh, you're just telling me you're a musician. Okay. Can you tell me anything else? Right, it gives you, you're not hearing words, right? It's the beginning of the line, we daren't omnes, right? It's gonna end up saying that small thing, look everybody, right? But yeah, it's just on the V syllable, and it's gonna go on like that for a while. So the focus is not on the text, it's on this novelty of these voices in contrast with each other, right? Which is the interesting thing. Obviously, polyphony will advance and change in the following centuries, right? But we already have this sense, okay, wow, a single melody can be split and recombined in interesting ways, and each line will have a different emotional effect on the hearer, right? And as creators, we can create more interesting music by allowing different voices to interact and intertwine with one another, okay? So let's think about that in terms of writing. So now I'm going to it's going to seem like a side tangent, but I do think it's relevant. We have Mikhail Bakhtin, who's a famous literary critic from the 20th century, who's writing about Dostoevsky here. But what he says, I think, applies equally well to Chaucer, if not better. Okay, so I'm going to read this to you out loud. Dostoevsky, like Goethe's Prometheus, creates not voiceless slaves, as does Zeus, but free people, capable of standing alongside their creator, capable of not agreeing with him, and even of rebelling against him. So think about the characters you see in the Canteburry Tales. Do they rebel against their creator? Are they capable of doing that? A plurality of independent and unmerged voices and consciousnesses, a genuine polyphony of fully valid voices, is in fact the chief characteristics of Chaucer's works. What unfolds in his works is not a multitude of characters and fates in a single objective world illuminated by a single authorial consciousness, rather a plurality of consciousnesses with equal rights and each with its own world combined, but are not merged in the unity of the event. The consciousness of a character is given as someone else's consciousness, another consciousness. Yet at the same time, it is not turned into an object, is not closed, does not become a single object of the author's consciousness. Okay, so lots of wormy, wiggly language there, but what is Bakhtin saying? Yes? Yeah, right. So as in human relationships with one another, like ideally we would work together. We each would have a voice in a relationship, whether it's a marriage or a class or, a friendship or a family, right? A functioning bond would hopefully result in everybody having a voice, being able to say what they think, and not always being stomped on by some like teacher or parent or, overbearing father or whatever, however you want to read a bad relationship version, right? Ideally, we all have a voice and are heard, right? So yeah, definitely that seems to be implicit here. What about great writing, fictional writing? Do you prefer novels and works of art where you're always sure exactly what you're supposed to think, you're always sure what the moral is, and you're very clear on the personality of the author? Like, is that interesting? Or would you prefer to, I guess you can tell where I stand here, but would you prefer to be in the sort of hall of mirrors that someone like Chaucer offers you, right, where you're not really sure, or Shakespeare, right? What does Shakespeare think about, I don't know, what does he think about suicide? Is it okay or is it not, We don't really know. It's not clear. Okay, what else? Yes? Yeah. Yeah. Right. Okay, so we're comparing two, Tolstoy's War and Peace or other novels of his, quite long, drawn-out meditations on specific thematic issues with characters that we follow through for a page, thousands of pages, compared to Chaucer's short and sweet conversations, about, as you said, dirty stories or, the central themes of Canterbury Tales, which we could maybe talk about, whatever those are. What does it mean to be a just citizen? What does a good marriage look like? How do we deal with a church or authorities that can be corrupt, right? What are our options in those cases, right? So Chaucer's stories explore those questions, but they don't seem to come down on any particular side. How do we make sense of fortune and fate, right? These entities that seem to rule our lives, that we don't seem to be able to interact with in any meaningful way. And even when we try to, like in The Knight's Tale, things go awry, right? Yeah. Okay. So again, this is what I think is cool about Chaucer, this sort of polyphony, right? That all these different voices can be heard. Okay. Now we have a moment for questions, comments. Anyone have anything they want to talk about or, anything you want to backtrack on? Okay. Sure? Now's your chance. Okay. Let's just move on. I don't want to talk about the wife of Bath. If you guys want to talk about the wife of Bath, we'll do that in a minute. Again, I asked you to have something you might want to discuss, textual analysis you'd like to do. Now's the time we're going to switch the screens so that I can put the text in front of us, and then we'll spend some time with the original Middle English for the first time in your honors sequence. You can read the text in its original. So I'm not going to let you go before, 4:40? Maybe I'll let you go a little early if you do a great job on this, okay? So, yes? Uh-huh. Right. Okay, the question is, do I have any theories on why Chaucer never finished the Canterbury Tales? Yes, I do, and a lot of people do. First of all, the Canterbury Tales, as it is organized into a series of fragments, okay? So there's fragment A, fragment B, fragment C. And if you actually read along, if you read through the whole Canterbury Tales, you would discover that, whereas sometimes texts are connected by these prologues where characters have conversations with one another, oh, that was an interesting story. It reminds me of this story. I'm going to tell you this now. All of a sudden, there'll be a break, and the conversation ends, and then we find ourselves in another chunk, and which seems to suggest either that Chaucer didn't glue those pieces together, those fragments together, or that somebody tampered with the manuscripts, Both questions are kind of open. We know that Chaucer wrote more than we have access to today. We have actually Chaucer's retraction at the end of the Canterbury Tales. Is it having issues? Okay, just keep playing. At the end of the Canterbury Tales, he actually, don't have a fit or whatever, just look away till we get it set up. Okay. Chaucer, at the end of the Canterbury Tales, writes his famous retraction. It's magic. Anyway, in his retraction, he says, basically, this is the end of the Canterbury Tales. If it offended anybody, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I take it all back. I retract everything I wrote, everything that doesn't pertain to holiness. So all those body tales, all those works of ribaldry, I take them back. It's as if I didn't write them. Please forgive me. And then he makes a long list of every story he ever wrote, a lot of which we don't have anymore. He wrote a book of saints' lives. He wrote some Canterbury tales that were included in the Canterbury Tales that we no longer have. So the big question is for literary detectives, what happened, right? Add to that the sort of question about Chaucer's disappearance in the year 1400. This is right about the time that Henry Bolingbroke takes the throne, and there was a sort of purging of civil servants, and it's possible that Chaucer just found himself on the wrong side of a political divide and was disappeared. Okay, he's actually very careful politically not to take sides on anything that would specifically align him with any political faction that might put him in danger. Unlike some of his friends, other poets who did get in political trouble, Chaucer's really, really canny about this. He's careful not to say stuff that shows that he's a Republican or a Democrat, just in case, the equivalent. But whatever the case, he still did, take on the church corruption. He took on the corrupt officials of the time. Not everybody was corrupt in the church, and not all the officials were corrupt, right? It's just some of them, right? So there is social critique there that could potentially offend somebody, and it is possible that he just wrote one thing too many, and somebody got their hands on some of his texts and got rid of the more offensive ones, right? So it could be that he wrote more than we have, and we know that he did, right? So those are some questions that are raised about Canterbury Tales. Whether he ever intended for all the characters to tell two stories on the way there and two stories on the way back, that seems to me like one of those Chaucerian hyperbolic moments where he's like, I will do this and it'll be awesome. But he never really intended to. It's possible. I mean, the structure of the Canterbury Tales is so elastic, right? That characters cut each other off, they stop each other's stories. So whether they would have told that number of stories in the first place is very unlikely, since they already cut off each other's stories. One of the great jokes in the Canterbury Tales, actually, that you guys probably won't read, but Chaucer, as the pilgrim, as the character in the story, is asked to tell a story. They're like, you've been really quiet this whole time, just staring at the floor like an elf. Do you have any stories for us? And Chaucer's like, oh, I'm not very good at telling stories. Chaucer's character. And so then he tells the story, and it's hilariously bad. It doesn't rhyme properly. The meter is all wonky. The subject matter is confused. And in the middle of the story, the host is just like, Namor, Isaiah, the drasty rhyming is not worth a turd, right? Your bad rhyming is not worth a turd, says the host to Chaucer as a character. So Chaucer like cuts off his own character's voice in the middle of a story. So there's lots of like playful stuff that's going on within the Canterbury Tales, you know. So who knows, right? Definitely he's emulating Boccaccio's Decameron, which has a similar structure. And actually, the Franklin's Tale, for example, few of these stories are actually original to Chaucer. He didn't generate much original material. He was borrowing stuff from from European folk traditions, from vernacular traditions, from other poets like Boccaccio. In the case of the Franklin's Tale, right, this story is told twice by Boccaccio in the Decameron. So Chaucer rewrites it, and he has Franklin tell it, and he does different things with the story, but the story is not original to him. Okay, that was a long answer to a short question. Yeah, other questions along those lines? Okay, now we have the, oh yes.
He's not really referenced much as a poet during his time, right? All these references that we have, is that correct? Or is that not really
It's corrected. Yeah, there are more. There's a big boom in like Chaucer being like super fancy. About 50 years after his death, everyone's like, "Hey, Chaucer was the best. Here's why." So then he kind of gets canonized, and we still have him canonized to this day. But he was well known in his time. Other poets were writing poems to him. They'd be like, "Here's a poem to my friend Chaucer," and they'll write a little poem to him. French poets were talking about him. You know, and he was Guillaume Michaud, called. He's a French poet, same period, called Chaucer le grand traducteur. He was the great translator, which is like kind of an insult, right? Like, oh yeah, I know Chaucer's work. He's a good translator, you know, which definitely prioritizes French literature over English literature, does all that kind of stuff. So he was famous enough. Yeah, and he was famous enough to write this sort of famous poem to Adam, his scribe, saying like, "Scribe, copy my stuff right, because I don't want bad editions coming out of my work. Like, make sure you copy what I wrote. Don't mess up your writing." So yeah, he was well known enough. He was probably, you know, one of the more well-known poets in his day. He was famous in his time. Which also adds to the Chaucerian persona, right? Because Chaucer's always like, "Oh, I was stupid, I'm dumb, I don't even know what's going on most of the time. I was just watching people," like that whole like self-effacing, self-deprecating persona that Chaucer like projects in the Canterbury Tales and in other stories of his. Certainly seems like a sly, artificial way to capture the benevolence of readers who might know him as the very famous poet with a lot of power, who has, you know, a lot of court influence. Okay, any other bigger picture questions about Chaucer, Canterbury Tales, 14th century? Yes. Yeah. 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 Okay. Yeah. So yeah, you're right. The part that you guys are reading, you're reading the first fragment, which is sometimes called the marriage group, right? That's how critics have chunked off the first part of the Canterbury Tales, which includes the Knight's Tale, the Miller's Tale, the Wife of Bath's Tale, Franklin's Tale, the Reeve's Tale, among others. And a lot of these texts do deal with the question of what marriage should be, what is the ideal platonic marriage, what is the reality on the ground, right? The Wife of Bath gives us a lot of snapshots of what we might call dysfunctional relationships. Her tale tells us something else, right? The Franklin's Tale also engages with this question, right? What is a good marriage? What do we owe each other as partners in a relationship? Well, I do have, actually, let's see, I think up here, yeah, this is the Wife of Bath, right? This is her prologue, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is a woman who's been married 5 times, right? Husband is at Tour, she had fever or something, yeah. And she's always traveling on pilgrimages and all that. And she ends up looking for a sixth husband on the trip, right? That might be why she's on pilgrimage. She could of that art of the old dance, right? We get this sort of characterization of the wife of Bath as, I don't know, like a black widow maybe, or, you know, a woman who exploits marriage to gain her own ends. She certainly is portrayed to a certain extent as a monster, right? We can read Wife of Bath in a lot of different ways. On one hand, she could be seen as a caricature of bad womanhood, right? Of the kind of woman that you don't want to marry, who's going to exploit you and, you know, steal your money and control you, right? She's like the embodiment and the coming to life of all of those stories of wicked wives that the clerks write, right? She is that thing. She's like a monster. On the other hand, we obviously can read the Wife of Bath as a fairly liberated and powerful woman who finds the power she can within the constraints of the marriage structure of the period, right? So the Wife of Bath sort of really brings to the fore the questions about what marriage should do, what kind of power it should give you, what are your obligations within the bonds of marriage, right? Interestingly enough then, of course, her tale is really problematic, right? I'm sure you were all disturbed by the Wife of Bath's tale, were you? We've got a main character who the first thing he does is rape an unprotected girl in the woods, right? And then what's his job? What does he have to do for the next year of his life? Try to figure out, yeah, what do women most desire? And what's the answer that Wife of Bath's tale tells us? What is it that women most desire? Yeah. Sovereignty, right? Sovereignty, yeah. Women want control in marriage. Okay, that's one point of view, right? Let's look at what the Franklin says, on the other hand. You guys read the Franklin as well. So here we have another one, another sort of perspective on what people want in marriage, okay? What's her name? Dorigen? Dorigen says, Siri will be your humble trower weave. Have heard me troth, till that mean heard breast. Thus spend they both in quiet and rest. For all things Sir is softly dari saya, that friendeds every other motabaya, if they will longer hold in company. Love will not been constrained be maestria. When maestria cometh, the God of love anon betteth his wings, and farewell he is gone. Love is a thing as any spirit free, woman of keen desire and liberty, and not to be constrained as a thrall. And so done men, if they so say and shall. So I'm going to translate this for you, starting with the italics, right? One thing, sirs, I can definitely say for sure. Friends must obey one another if they want to hold company together for long. Love cannot be constrained by mastery, okay? Love cannot be constrained by mastery. When mastery comes, I mean, we might need to talk about how we would translate mastery. When mastery comes, the God of love definitely beats his wings and he flies away. Love is a thing that's free, like any spirit would be, right? Love is a free thing. Women, by their nature, desire to be free. They desire liberty. And not to be constrained like slaves. And so do men, if I do say so, right? So here, the Franklin seems to be arguing what? You can't have love if, yeah. If there's too much what? Yeah. Yeah, right. You can't have love when somebody is the controlling partner, right? If somebody dictates everything you do and tells you how you're going to behave and who you're going to be, right? You might not be as likely to be in love with them. I don't know if this is true for everybody. I hope it's more true than not, right? And definitely true of marriage, right? Hopefully, a healthy marriage should allow both parties in the partnership to be free enough, right? Does that mean they don't obey one another? No, right? It seems to suggest also there's a certain amount of obedience. But there should be like how do I say this? Some give and take between these two poles of liberty and obedience, right? And dominance or sovereignty, right? Souveraineté, as the Wife of Bath calls it, that's bad, right? If anyone has sovereignty in a marriage, be she female or male, we've got a problem. Yeah.
So Chaucer has like that principle that marriage is about equality. Was that the common standpoint of the time?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I heard Chaucer has this sort of, at least he puts forward the idea, right? Because as I mentioned earlier, it's not clear that's what Chaucer thinks, right? He just allows the Franklin to say it through the voice of one of his characters, right? So does Chaucer think that women all want to have power over their husband? Does he believe actually that, marriage should be marriage of minds and deal with equality? We don't know, right? Certainly in this period, there was a lot of discussion about what an ideal marriage should be. And there certainly was the faction that we see in the Wife of Bath's prologue, right? Those people who write those books of wicked wives, which are all about, why women are terrible, why marriage is terrible, why you should avoid marriage, it's bad for you, right? So there certainly is this sort of anti-feminist, misogynistic literature that is certainly prominent in this period. On the other hand, there are major female writers and male writers writing about, I don't know what we would call it, rethinking what it means to be married on more equal footing, right? We could argue that Chaucer's certainly doing that. Writers like Christine de Pizan or Marie de France, even female mystics and male mystics also, were talking about, well, if we see becoming a nun or a monk as marrying Jesus and entering into a relationship with God that's holy, where everybody's hearing everybody else, well, shouldn't human marriages emulate that as well, right? So if the human family is a microcosm of creation itself, then shouldn't we have justice and free will, in that nuclear family? So certainly those ideas are on the table and being discussed. And that kind of brings me to another point about Chaucer. I don't know if you noticed this, at the end of the Franklin's Tale, for example, the Franklin ends the tale with this question: who was more generous or whatever, right? Who was more noble of the three main characters and their choices, right? Seems to be asking a question of the audience, right? And so that could be the Franklin asking the fictional Canterbury pilgrims what they think, right? Who was the more noble of the characters? Who made the most glorious sacrifice at the end of that story? But it also seems to suggest like the kind of work that literature does in this period, which is often like, here's an awesome story that's going to raise a lot of questions. It's going to confuse you more than it teaches you some sort of moral. And the ultimate goal is, after we all sit and hear it together, because of course literature is being performed in social settings, right? People aren't reading books alone quietly in their rooms, right? They're prelecting. They're reading out loud to one another, right? In social settings. So if you tell a story about, say, like, who gave up more, the husband, the wife, or the lover, or maybe the magician, right? The question then afterwards would be, what do you guys think, right? And then the group of people who had heard the story would then have a conversation about it, right? And different people would have different opinions about who was the most noble and what the ultimate point of the Franklin's Tale is, right? And so we really have to think of medieval literature and other literature, earlier literature, as a very social literature whose purpose is, on one level, definitely to generate conversation and debate. So to bring this back to the question of debates about marriage, certainly the querelle de femmes, which is in French, the argument about women, was a big subject of literary debate. So the question here is, why do women have to have a subservient position to men? Is it fair? Is it just? Are women made fundamentally differently from men, right? And the jury was out on this question, right? So you could come to the table and debate with your peers and not colleagues, but friends in the court or whatever. I believe women should have equal rights. We shouldn't be constrained to marry people we don't want to marry. And somebody else would be, no, that would ruin the fabric of society. And the whole point of the debate was to have a conversation about it. So, I think that's kind of what's going on in the marriage group of Chaucer. Certainly when you dig into the questions about marriage that are raised in those tales. I mean, the only thing that seems certain is infidelity. So maybe Chaucer has a little bit of a jaded view about that particular issue, right? But where he stands on those questions, I mean, really is anybody's guess. Yeah. Okay. Does anyone want to look at a passage they were curious about? Yes.
There's a picture that you keep skipping over when you switch between slides. Would you mind explaining it?
Oh. Yeah. Okay. Speaking of parties, medieval parties, medieval people were obsessed with cleaning themselves, okay? There's another one of those misconceptions about the Middle Ages. Like, you want to wash your hands before every course, right? You wash yourself, you bathe often, right? And so the act of washing yourself in social settings is really important to medieval people. So they created these, like, hilarious vases. They're called aquamaniles. It literally means hand washers. And they're little pitchers. They all have like a mechanism in them. Engineers will be interested. They often have a trick mechanism, so you're not quite sure how they pour. And so in the act of pouring, you're going to get like wine or water on yourself, right? And that's part of the joke. But they often have humorous illustrations that everybody would know, okay? And this one is hilarious. And this is Phyllis and Aristotle. So Aristotle was married, or did he marry Phyllis? I can't remember. But anyway, Aristotle, the great philosopher. This is a apocryphal story that was very popular in the Middle Ages. Aristotle saw the most beautiful woman in Athens, Phyllis, and he was just totally like prostrated by her. He just found her so beautiful, and he couldn't concentrate on his work at all until she gave him her love, right? And so he went from being this noble philosopher and representative of the highest virtues to being love's slave, right? And so he told Phyllis, I will die if you don't love me. And Phyllis is like, okay, fine. I will sleep with you if you take off all your clothes and walk around Athens on your hands and knees, and I ride you like a horse. And so Aristotle, being so brought low by love, does this, right? And so what's the moral? What's the moral? Love makes everyone a fool, even the great philosophers of the world, right? There's obviously an erotic charge to it too, right? The position of Phyllis's hands and her performance of sovereignty, right? So the reason why I have this image here is, of course, not only poetry in the period, but even the way that the tables were set would generate debate about what is marriage. Does it turn you into basically an animal, right? A beast that, what's that thing from Hamlet? A beast that lacks reason, right? Or is it something that elevates you? Yeah.
Was Chaucer married?
Was he what?
Married?
He was, yeah. He was married. And we know very little about his wife. Yeah, Philippa Chaucer. She was, Philippa Chaucer. She was a lady in waiting to one of the queens of the period, though. So she had quite a bit of social status. And it seems like Chaucer married her to climb socially a little bit. And it worked. Chaucer ended up his life as a member of parliament, and then his son actually ended up becoming a knight. So he became one of the lower ranks of the nobility. So that upward mobility that you see in Chaucer's life continued after his death, and his family got more powerful, yeah. Vases like this, aquamaniles, yeah, something this fancy, this is probably gold-plated, would probably have only been for rich people, but middle class and even poor people also had humorous jugs. If you go to museums, you'll see these, they could be made out of glass or ceramic, and yeah, they will have hilarious images like this. If you go to the Met Museum in New York or something, or even the MFA in Boston, you'll find, hopefully, some of these aquamaniles. They were really interesting. Medieval table setting is hilarious and interesting, worth talking about. Okay. So some final questions for further discussion. In your preceptorials, not here, don't worry. What is the modern legacy of the European vernacular tradition? When we're talking about medieval and Renaissance, and even people like Apuleius, right, and Golden Ass, what is the legacy of that storytelling tradition in our world, right? To This is a question I've been asking this whole time. Are the characters in Chaucer caricatures, exempla, an equivalent of simulacrum of real people, or what? Are there times when something's ambiguity makes it more powerful? And finally, what do we owe the past? Okay, this is a big question for me. Do we owe a time like the Middle Ages our attention, on our actual intentionality of learning something about it instead of just assuming we know about it, right? Do we, as citizens and scholars, need to sort of treat people in the past and events of the past with the same dignity and respect that we might treat other cultures that we live in conjunction with today, right, at the same time, contemporaneous with, okay? So do we have an ethical responsibility to the past to learn something about it, okay? So thank you. I leave you with this medieval Renaissance minor if you're interested in such a thing. You could always contact me by email if you're interested in Middle English. I'm always available during office hours to look over stuff. And thank you for your attention.